My name is Marcia Hoffman. I'm a senior staff attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation in San Francisco, and I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Stanford Law School Center for Internet and Society. And this is my colleague, Seth Schoen. He is a senior staff technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation with me. How many of you have heard of our organization? Oh, that's awesome. That's great. How many are members, just out of curiosity? Okay. How many of you are non-US citizens? Excellent, good. How many of you travel to the United States from time to time? Okay, that's very cool. One more question for you. How many of you are responsible for your company's IT policies? Okay, all right. So Seth and I, over the past year, have spent a lot of time writing about searches of electronics and digital information at the US border. And we completed a paper in December, which we published on our website, and you have a version of it on your conference CDs that's been updated in light of some of our more recent thinking. And so we wanted to do a presentation here at Black Hat to talk about our findings. A lot of people seem to be very, very interested in this subject, the question of what the US government can do at the border with digital devices and digital information. It turns out they can do a great deal, and that concerns a lot of people. It concerns business travelers. It concerns people who just really value privacy. This seems to be a real hot button issue for people. So what we're going to talk about today, first of all, is the legal situation at the border. Now, I am a US lawyer, and what I mostly know is US law. And so I'm going to be talking mostly about the legal situation at the US border, but I think it's safe to assume that when you are traveling across other international borders, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is going to apply there too. And where I know there are certain issues that you should be aware of at other borders, I'm going to do my best to flag that. We're also going to talk about the policies and procedures that govern border searches at the US border by component offices of the Department of Homeland Security. We're going to talk briefly about the considerations you might take into account when you're choosing a strategy for protecting your data when you're crossing an international border. And then Seth is going to talk a bit about some of the technical and common sense measures that we think people can take to protect their devices at the border. So that's kind of how we're going to go with this. So like I said, this talk comes out of this white paper that we published. I don't know how many of you have read it. I hope that if you find our talk interesting, you'll take a closer look at it, because it's certainly far more detailed than what we're likely to get into here today. We're going to do kind of a basic overview of some of our findings. And if you are looking for more information in depth, please take a look at that, or feel free to come talk to us. We're here this whole conference. So Seth and I worked on this together. We decided to make this something that would have a legal perspective and also a technical perspective. And we had a great deal of assistance from an attorney named Rowan Reynolds, who volunteered at EFF last year. So a very important overarching principle that I think we need to remember when we're talking about searches at the border is that it's a very difficult situation that doesn't have a whole lot of hard and fast rules. I think that border agents have a great deal of discretion to perform searches of pretty much anything that comes across the border. That includes things that you might pack in your luggage, but it also includes your electronic devices. And I think that if you get into a situation in which a border agent is interested in you for whatever reason, that can turn into a high stress and sometimes confrontational situation. And I think that that's something that worries a lot of people. And the situation at the border is one where you're dealing with a government agent in a way that is unfamiliar. I think that many of us feel that when you are interacting with a law enforcement agent, there are certain rules that tend to apply. There are some regulations on their ability to search things and to seize things. And I think a lot of people feel that when you are speaking with a government agent and they're questioning you, you have a right to have an attorney present. And that's true in many situations, but these are some of these familiar rules that frankly just don't apply at the border. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview about the law that applies at the border. In the United States, the major constitutional provision that would be in play is the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which guarantees that the people shall be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. So what that tends to mean, the general rule that we can take away from that is that, as a general matter, the government has to get a warrant if it is going to search something in which you have a reasonable expectation of privacy, such as your property. This would include your personal effects and your computer. But there are circumstances where that general rule just doesn't apply. And unfortunately, one of those circumstances is at the border. And the courts in the United States that have looked at this question have held that searches that occur at the border are just reasonable per se. And since the Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, what that means is that the government doesn't have to get a warrant. Now, why is that? So the United States Supreme Court explained this a little bit in one of the most prominent cases on border search. And you can see the quote here. I'm not going to read it to you, but basically the idea here is that the government has a very, very strong interest in preventing the entry of unwanted people and property at the border. And this is something that goes back to the earliest days of the US Constitution. So basically, because the government has such a strong interest in protecting itself from undesirable things and people coming across the border, it has a very wide-ranging authority to search and question people and to examine their things that they bring across the border. And so because that interest is so strong, virtually any search that occurs at the border is just considered reasonable. The one exception is that the Supreme Court has recognized, actually was in this case, Flores-Montano, is the search of an individual's alimentary canal. So basically, that is the only time that the government even has to have a reasonable suspicion of wrongdoing. Otherwise, they can perform searches without any suspicion of wrongdoing whatsoever, meaning that they could even randomly stop you and search your things, including your computer. So various organizations, including ours, have argued in court that this is really too expansive, particularly considering the fact that electronic devices can potentially contain so much information about a person. Certainly proprietary information. I am a lawyer. I tend to think of things like privileged confidential client information. But often it would include personal information too, right? I mean, your communications with your family and friends and associates over time, your web browsing history, perhaps your financial and medical information. And it seems to really defy logic that should all just be up for grabs when you cross the border. And I think a lot of people think that shouldn't be the rule. The various organizations that have tried to challenge this in court have tried to argue, a computer is nothing like a piece of luggage. I mean, if you bring a piece of luggage into the country, you're going to have some clothing in there and some personal effects, but it just pales in comparison to the things that the government can paw through in your digital devices. And the rule shouldn't simply be the same just because it's a personal effect. But unfortunately, the courts have not been sympathetic to that argument, and they have held, at this point uniformly, that the government needs no suspicion of wrongdoing whatsoever to search your devices at the border. We cite here a case called United States versus Arnold, which is the most recent and perhaps the most famous on this question. It was in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is considered one of the most liberal in the country. And in that case, the lower court, the district court, held initially that computers are just very special and different, and they present different privacy concerns, and therefore the government has to have at least a reason to suspect wrongdoing before they can search a computer at the border. But the appeals court disagreed and said no. If we look at all of the cases going back, there's just really no basis for that, and we think that the rule is the same as it is for luggage. So no suspicion of wrongdoing needed. And so at this point, unfortunately, the case law is pretty consistent on that point. There are a couple of cases winding their way through the courts right now, one called House versus Napolitano, the other Abador versus Napolitano. The Napolitano refers to Janet Napolitano, who's the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, so she's being named in her professional capacity there as the defendant. And these are both cases that are being litigated by the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU. And it remains to be seen how those cases will turn out. We hope for a better ruling in those ones. So that's the situation at the border. Basically, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a US citizen or a non-US citizen, nobody really has much in the way of any sort of legal right at the border to protect the privacy of their things or their information. So let's talk a little bit about what we know about agency policies and procedures for performing searches at the border. I think a lot of people find the structure of the Department of Homeland Security confusing. So we're going to talk a little bit about the various agencies that you may have heard of and which ones you might be likely to encounter during a border search or a border inspection. So DHS is the Department of Homeland Security. It is kind of the big overall blanket organization or agency. And these first three are components, or smaller agencies within the Department of Homeland Security. How many of you have heard of TSA? Okay, that's the Transportation Security Administration. Actually, when you cross the border, you will not encounter this agency at all. This agency is responsible for security and conducting security inspections basically within the United States. And so if you happen to be in the United States and you're flying from one airport in the United States to another, then TSA is the one that will do security there. And these are the ones that have the naked body scanners that everybody gets really, really upset about, certainly. And these are the ones that will X-ray your carry-on baggage, and these are the people who operate the magnetometers that you walk through. That's TSA. You really don't encounter these guys at the border. CBP is Customs and Border Protection. These are the people, when you enter the United States, they do the passport checks. And this is the agency that's primarily responsible for border inspection. And so chances are, most likely, that if somebody's going to inspect your computer, it may well be CBP. ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And I tend to think of CBP as kind of more of a bureaucratic agency, but ICE is more of an enforcement agency. And they have authority to investigate immigration and customs violations and violations of law at the border. And so if an inspection escalates, it's entirely possible that ICE might be searching a device. And so these are also people you might run into. INS, a lot of people ask about. That's an agency that actually doesn't exist anymore. It was pre-Department of Homeland Security, and now it's been kind of wrapped into the Department of Homeland Security, and its functions sort of distributed to other little component agencies. But these are not people that you are likely to deal with anymore because this agency doesn't exist. So here are some of the things that border agents can do without any suspicion of wrongdoing whatsoever. They can detain travelers temporarily, up to a few hours, for questioning. They can detain your possessions temporarily. This includes taking possession of a device to analyze or to copy the data on it. They can certainly ask you lots of questions, though only a judge can really force you to answer questions, and we'll talk more about that later. And they, of course, have the authority to refuse admission. And one of the most frustrating things about dealing with agents at the border is the fact that they have tremendous discretion to make these decisions. And so if you ask the question, well, what can get you refused admission? That's a very difficult question to answer because I think it depends on the circumstances and who you're dealing with. I think one agent might refuse admission where another might not. So both Customs and Border Protection, which is CBP, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is ICE, actually have published policies that you can download and read that explain and give guidance to their agents on how to inspect devices at the border. And so through looking at these policies, we actually have a bit of a sense of how they do what they do. So, and if you're interested in taking a look at these policies in full, you can actually just find them on the DHS website. Maybe just Google like CBP device inspection policy or something. You'll come right up with this stuff. So CBP's policy makes clear that their agents can inspect electronic devices and data with or without individualized suspicion of the traveler. CBP says that they can keep a device for a brief, reasonable time, which usually doesn't exceed 5 days. They may send the device or data, a copy of the data, to another agency if they need help making sense of the data. That is, if they encounter an encrypted version of data that they're trying to decrypt, if they're having some technical problems, or if the data happens to be in a foreign language which they can't understand. They might seek the assistance of another agency to help understand what they're reading. It's worth noting that the policies don't make clear what happens to those copies of the data that are sent to other agencies. It's clear that the policies anticipate that agents may run across sensitive data, things like medical information or privileged information in one way or another, but it's not clear what they do when they run across that data. Basically the policies say, be sure to talk to a lawyer higher up in the agency if you need help figuring out what to do. But the actual procedure for handling that information isn't clear. So ICE's policy is very similar. Again, they can inspect information or devices with or without individualized suspicion. They are required as a general matter to complete searches of detained items within 30 days, but we've heard stories suggesting that under certain circumstances it can take much longer. They also can seek help from other agencies, and it is again unclear how they handle privileged or sensitive data. So we wanted to talk a little bit about how to interact with agents that you encounter at the border, given the fact that we know that they are able to, they have expansive authority to search items. We think that one thing that is important to keep in mind is that they may be more likely to want to search an item if they sense that you're not cooperative. And so we would suggest if you're crossing the border, you consider avoiding giving agents excuses to become concerned about you or concerned about your possessions. It is very important not to lie to border agents. That actually is in and of itself a crime. And if they ask you something like, do you know the password to this, and you do and you say no, that in and of itself can get you in so much more trouble than if perhaps you had just given it to them. It's also important not to obstruct an agent's investigation. That can, again, be a separate crime. And we're going to talk about situations where these concerns may come up a little bit later. And it's, I think, important to be polite to people. I think that they're likely to give you an easier time if you are trying to be gracious and professional about a situation. If you really feel that you don't want to turn over information, I think you certainly don't have to do that, but you should recognize that that doesn't mean that you have to be obnoxious when you do it. I see a question, yes?
So if I have to tell them yes, I know the password to the device, is it obstructing the investigation if I don't put the password in?
Okay, we're going to get to this sort of stuff later. So just hold that one, we'll put a pin in it, and we'll come right back to that. So, as I mentioned, you may choose not to answer questions. You should recognize that even if you technically may have a right not to answer questions, it can still have adverse consequences. It may lead to your questioning, whereas you may not have been questioned otherwise. In a really extreme circumstance, if you're dealing with a very difficult person, I think it could even mean that you don't get admission to the country. And so for this reason, Seth and I think that it's worth considering whether IT policies, might be put in place that would give employees of companies external reasons for not answering questions, such as, maybe you might have a situation where a border agent says, could you please give us the password? And you say, I'm sorry, I can't do that because my company has a policy that says I can't do it. I think it feels much better, and it's much preferable to be able to point to an external reason why you can't do something or you're not willing to do something that's not just, I don't want to. And I think that may tend to make your interactions certainly more smooth. Okay, so choosing a strategy. One thing that we realized was that there really isn't one strategy that everybody should adopt for protecting data at the border. It depends a lot on you and your personal circumstances and what your situation is. And so we think that it's best to think through this in advance and figure out if you have some sensitive factors that might suggest that a certain strategy is more important than another. And some of the factors that we've identified as being potentially important, this is not an exclusive list, is, for example, your citizenship or your immigration or resident status. Do you feel like you are particularly vulnerable at the border? I think that United States citizens have an easier time getting across the border than those who are not United States citizens. I think that certain people feel that they wouldn't want to jeopardize, for example, a residency status, by appearing to be difficult at the border. And so if you feel that you have certain sensitivities along those lines, it's worth considering. Time sensitivities are also important. Do you need to be at a particular place at a particular time? If you are detained at the border and questioned and you're held up, is it going to cause a big problem for you? What kind of tolerance do you have for having difficult interactions with border agents? You brought up the password thing, and we'll talk about that certainly at great length later. But do you want a situation where you're bringing in encrypted data and you're asked for your password and you say, no, I'm not giving it to you? Or would you feel better about a situation where they say, we want your password, and you say, I don't know it? If you're not being difficult because you don't know something, that certainly, I think, tends to take some pressure off of you as a person. Another question is, how important is it for you to have access to data during your journey? I mean, could you consider bringing a blank device over the border and perhaps downloading data when you get there? A related question is, how good is your internet access when you reach your destination? Are you actually going to have the logistical capability to download data if you want to do that? Another thing that's important to think of is the places that you visited on your trip before entering the country, because I think that certain countries tend to raise certain red flags for border agents. For example, in the Arnold case that I mentioned earlier, United States versus Arnold, the defendant in that case was coming back from the Philippines, and I think that raised a red flag for border agents because they think that men coming back from certain countries may have been engaging in certain activities that they are on the lookout for. And so, that's something to consider. And then finally, your history with law enforcement. Are you likely to get more hassle from border agents because you are of interest to them? Or because perhaps if you've noticed, for example, we're contacted by a number of people who find themselves being a watch list misidentification. Do you have problems like that? These are things that are worth thinking about. So now I'm going to turn it over to Seth, and he's going to talk to you a bit about some of the precautions that you can take before you travel and some of the technical strategies that you can use to protect data.
Thanks, Marcia. So I think something that all travelers can benefit from is both keeping regular backups and encrypting the disks that they're taking on their trip. And I think these are two sides of the same coin, because keeping backups is about making sure that you have access to your data, and encrypting your drive is about making sure that other people don't have access to your data, which are both important security properties. And I think this is true even for reasons beyond border search privacy concerns, and even for people who don't plan to refuse to tell their password to CBP if asked, for example. Because it's very, very easy to lose mobile devices when you're traveling. People often leave them in taxis. I had a friend who visited me from Brazil, and he managed to lose 2 mobile phones and a laptop during his trip in San Francisco, on the same trip in like a week. So these things happen, and I just think it would be much better, even if you only lose 1 mobile phone or 1 laptop, it would be much better if that's encrypted and if you have a backup, because then you have this level of peace of mind while you're traveling, that you're not going to lose your only copy of something, and that strangers aren't going to get that information without your knowledge. And if you do feel that you're going to turn over your password if asked, you still have the advantage at the border that you know whether or not the agents have looked at your information. They're not going to be able to do it without your knowledge or without your cooperation. There's also, of course, the possibility of using only online network storage and not carrying things with you. So we have a lot of thoughts, which we've talked about in our paper and which we're going to talk about very quickly here, about various ways of not carrying things with you as you cross the border. And of course, there are quite a lot of permutations here, quite a lot of ways that you can arrange not to carry things with you. An interesting one, if you have a laptop with an easily removable hard drive, or you like using DD, is to use a separate hard drive or a separate hard drive image for your chip compared to the one that you normally use. So some laptops have a hard drive bay right on the side. The laptop slides right out. You can actually have 2, keep one at home, use one for travel. You can also sort of simulate that by making a byte-for-byte image copy of your hard drive with DD or with something like Ghost. Another basic concept that's becoming increasingly popular is to upload something in one place and then download it in another place. There are some devices like Chromebooks that make this the default behavior. There's also this important issue that if you aren't separately encrypting the data that you've uploaded, then your network storage service provider will have access to it also, which could be a security vulnerability in itself. So it's certainly preferable to pre-encrypt the things before uploading them to network storage provider. I have actually met someone who would send her mobile phone in the mail because she was very prone to being stopped at the border. She had had it happen several times. She had somehow attracted the interest of US Customs and Border Protection, and they would stop her on every trip. And so she reached this level of frustration, and she decided that she was actually going to send her phone in the mail before re-entering the United States, and it's a possibility. It's worth noting that things that you send in the mail or with a carrier like FedEx can still be inspected by customs when they enter the country. There's an interesting question about the circumstances under which they can open letters. I think our conclusion was that under some circumstances they can even open letters, although it's much more constrained by policy than opening a parcel or package that has a customs declaration. But the big advantage, of course, to sending something in the mail is not that it won't be inspected, but that you won't be getting questioned by Customs and Border Protection at the same time that the thing is being inspected. It will eventually arrive, hopefully, and you won't have people saying, "What can you tell me about this device that you're carrying with you? Can you unlock it for me?" and so on. We also think that Customs and Border Protection has no authority to alter or bug equipment without getting a warrant to do so. So we think that as a general matter, they can't just say, "Oh, that's interesting, this person is mailing a laptop into the country. Let's just put a bug on it." We don't think that that would be permitted by law. I wanted to talk really quickly about password strength for full disk encryption. I think it's a topic that a lot of people are probably already familiar with. You may know that EFF built a machine to crack the data encryption standard back around 1998. So our nonprofit organization was able to crack 56-bit keys in 1998. So these passwords here are all about 56 bits of entropy. So it's very likely that the government can crack them if it's so inclined. And in fact, there are rainbow tables for password cracking. And depending on how your disk crypto implements key derivation, it's likely that you may not be able to remember a long enough random string to get outside of the rainbow tables that have been published. The government may have better cracking capability than you. And so there are a lot of ideas for ways to choose a good passphrase. There are lots of resources on this. There's a technique called diceware from Arnold Reinhold. And it's basically a technique for choosing random words. If you actually do the calculation, there was a great XKCD panel about this sometime last year. If you actually do the math, you can see that choosing a small number of random words can give you as much entropy in your passphrase as choosing some unpronounceable string. So here's an unpronounceable string that's really hard to remember. And if you had just a few truly random words, you could actually reach a similar entropy level, but you might actually remember them. Okay. If you think random.choice in Python chooses good random numbers, you can choose random words out of a dictionary. Find out how many bits are in your passphrase. Okay. Yeah, I think passphrase strength is something that people are becoming fairly familiar with, but it's a good thing to keep an eye on. Of course, there are systems that are using key derivation or key stretching, like PBKDF2, where they'll do some expensive thing to derive the actual crypto key from your passphrase, and that makes brute force attacks a lot harder. My advice is, if you don't know how your disk encryption system uses key derivation, then you should treat it as if it doesn't, and make sure that you choose an adequately strong passphrase to resist brute force attacks. I think I want to hand it back over to Marcia to talk a little bit about the question of, if you have this great passphrase that you remember, and you know it, and you're coming across the border, and they say, so, would you mind unlocking your disk for us? What will happen then?
Okay, we get this question a lot, and this is something that I think deserves a little bit of time. So, in the United States, we have a constitutional amendment called the Fifth Amendment, and among other things, it says that you can't be forced to be a witness against yourself. And the origin of this constitutional right is the days when the authorities would torture people to turn over information about themselves. And this is basically intended to ensure that if the government is going to prosecute you for something, the evidence that they get is not something that they force you to reveal to them that only you know, but rather evidence that they collect in the course of their investigation. And so basically they can't make you give them the information that they're going to use to go after you. So this is the rule in the United States. And the rule requires, in order for you to have this protection, three things need to be present. First of all, the government has to compel you to give testimonial evidence against yourself. And when I say testimonial, what I mean is it needs to be something that's in your mind. They have to be forcing you to turn over something that you know, that isn't memorialized anywhere, and that isn't physical evidence. And the last thing is, it would have to tend to incriminate you. And when I say incriminate, what I mean is not something that shows evidence of your guilt, but something that they might use to bring a prosecution against you. And it doesn't need to be direct evidence itself. It could be something that's just a link in the chain that would, tend to incriminate you. And so if you have a situation where there is something on your computer that might tend to incriminate you, you may very well have a valid Fifth Amendment right not to turn over that information. It is very, very important to know that this is not the case in all countries. And there are several countries, in fact, that have key disclosure laws where the government can force people under certain circumstances to decrypt data or to turn over encryption passphrases under the right circumstances. And some of these laws are in, for example, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands has one, France has one, Australia, Canada, Finland, Belgium. And so it's important to know if you are taking encrypted data somewhere and you know your encryption passphrase, it's important to know whether or not a country has such a law. I also understand that Russia and China require people bringing encrypted data into those countries to seek permission of the government to do so. And so I think it's also important to consider whether or not you are going to a country that has a law like that. So even if you have a valid right, excuse me, not to turn over information, you should be aware that refusing to provide that information could still have adverse consequences for you. For example, it may lead a border agent to conclude that you're difficult, and it could lead to questioning or even, in a very extreme case, refusal of admission. So we think it's important to think before your trip about how you would deal with requests to decrypt information. And again, I mentioned before that we think an IT policy could be helpful in certain situations, and this is one of them. You could have a policy where your employees actually don't know their encryption passwords while they're traveling, and they only learn them upon reaching the destination. And so, I think that puts them in a much better feeling position if they're being asked to turn over an encryption password, because they can simply say, listen, I honestly don't know it, and you're not lying, and there's nothing you can do. And I think that, in some circumstances, that might be a pretty decent solution. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Seth.
So the idea of not knowing your password, I think, is a very interesting one. It's one that I've been thinking about a lot. I should say it's not clear yet how readily border agents will believe you if you tell them the truth that you don't know the password to your own computer. They're probably much more accustomed to people actually knowing their own password, because that's certainly the common case. And so there is this question of whether they believe you. But certainly in terms of the ability to truthfully refuse to cooperate because you're simply unable to give them the information that they want, it seems like a potentially powerful tactic. So if you don't have an IT department doing this for you, one way you could do it for yourself is to change your disk passphrase to something that you can't remember because it's a random thing that's not memorable to you, and send that in some other way. And there are lots of choices about what that other way could be. Encrypted email, giving it to someone else who's traveling separately, lots of possibilities. Now, I'm traveling from the United States because I live in the United States. So when I end this trip, I'll be going home to the US. And I personally am concerned about border searches and taking precautions against them. There are statistics that the American Civil Liberties Union obtained from the government under the Freedom of Information Act about how frequently border searches of electronic devices occur. And it came out to about 300 per month, which is very few in terms of the number of people who enter the United States. Do you remember what year that was for?
That was from, let's see, October 2008 to June 2010 was the time period.
And it came out to about 300 per month. So on the one hand, searches of electronic devices, intrusively looking through what people have on their computers, are actually extraordinarily rare as a proportion of travelers. At the same time, I personally know 3 people to whom this has happened, and so it feels like a very concrete and real possibility to me. I feel that it's not random, and it feels like a real thing to me because I know these 3 people who've had this happen to them, in some cases on multiple occasions, not just once. And so I'm interested in experimenting with precautions that I can take. The approach that I've chosen to try on this particular trip to the Netherlands, I use Ubuntu, and so I have full disk encryption using Lux. And Lux has a concept of key slots. So you have the ability to have up to 8 different passphrases, any one of which is valid to decrypt your hard drive. So what you can do, that would represent my original passphrase. That's not actually my salt for my real passphrase, but can generate a totally random and non-memorable thing. and then add that thing as an additional passphrase in a secondary key slot. And then there are two different key slots, each of which has an independent passphrase. And then if I have some way to have or get the non-memorable one at home where I'm returning to, or to my destination in the US, then skipping a few details about Luke's trying to prevent you from locking yourself out of your own computer, even if you wanted to, you can kill the original slot that contained your original passphrase, and then you no longer know the passphrase to decrypt your drive. And so I've actually done that on this trip. I have a passphrase that I left at home in the United States that I don't know and can't remember. And when I'm going to cross the border, before doing so, I'm going to kill the key slot on my laptop that contains the passphrase that I know. When I return home, I have access to another passphrase that will be valid, but I won't have it at the time that I'm crossing the border. So that was actually relatively easy to set up. So it's an interesting possibility. I've tried other encryption possibilities, other approaches at other times. Yeah.
But wouldn't you have constructive knowledge? I mean, couldn't you be compelled by a judge because it's under your control to get that password to decrypt?
So one distinction, and Marcia can maybe elaborate on this, is that the judge compelling you to do something requires you to actually be implicated in an actual criminal investigation, which is different from, I don't mean that you have to be the suspect, but there has to actually be a specific criminal investigation about a specific crime in order for the judge to compel evidence to be turned over within the US. And this is different from the situation at the border, where they can just ask me just because they feel like it, just because I happen to be crossing the border. And so it's absolutely correct that by having my passphrase written down, I have lesser legal protection than I ordinarily would at home in the US, in the sense that any Fifth Amendment right that I might have no longer applies to prevent me from turning over that piece of paper. On the other hand, compared to the border, where no suspicion and no reason whatsoever is necessary, I still have relatively greater protection.
Yep, I agree. Remember, I think the key to this is, remember that I said that the Fifth Amendment right applies in a situation where they're trying to compel something from your mind. So that's kind of the key there. If they happen to know that Seth had written down his password and they wanted to obtain a warrant to seize it, then that wouldn't be a Fifth Amendment issue, but rather a Fourth Amendment issue. And in theory, they could do that.
So there's this great design called Keypad. I don't know if any of you have read this paper from the University of Washington. I really admire this design. Unfortunately, they have not released their code, so I'm actually quite interested in re-implementing it. I don't really have time to give the whole scheme, but this is an alternative way, among other things, of not knowing your password. And it also provides a lot of advantages if a device is lost or stolen, not just at the border, but at any time. This is sort of like, strangely enough, a digital rights management system, except that the person whose computer it is ultimately does have access to the keys. They ultimately can decrypt, and they ultimately can export files from the system. But every time they want to access a file, they have to request a decryption key for that file from a server. And under normal circumstances where the person is in possession of their device, the server will automatically grant the decryption key and allow the person to read their files. But under exceptional circumstances, such as if the device has been lost, or perhaps if the person is currently crossing the border, the server could be programmed not to grant those keys, and therefore the device would be unable to read those files. Anyway, these researchers from the University of Washington implemented this. They're particularly interested in benefits for people like doctors who have a lot of sensitive information and obligations to tell people if that information is lost or stolen. And in this way, they can say, well, if the device is lost, they can turn off the key server and say, no further accesses to the files on that device will succeed. but it's also potentially relevant in a border context. So I would love to re-implement this, and I think we should. And I think Google should do the same thing in Chrome OS. And I think it's very feasible to implement exactly this kind of thing in Chrome OS. And in general, we can get into these concepts about mandatory access control, and in a sense about digital rights management, even though in this case it's really for the protection of the end user and not to ultimately limit their ability to use files in the way that they want to. By implementing systems where physically possessing the device is not the only thing that you need in order to have access to read the files on the device. So I think there are a lot of possibilities for that and a lot of approaches for that. That will be interesting. I just wanted to say briefly that it's relatively hard to delete stuff, and forensics is relatively effective. There are a lot of examples of that. You may know Simpson Garfinkel bought a whole bunch of used hard drives on the used hard drive market, also known as eBay. And he went and looked at what was on these used hard drives that had been decommissioned, and he found that very often people had attempted to delete the things on the hard drive before selling it and not succeeded, because they had used their ordinary delete command or they had used their ordinary format command, and it did a high-level format or it did a high-level delete, and it didn't overwrite the blocks actually containing the data. And so, very often deleting things don't. And file systems are getting more advanced, so even secure delete may not. This is a frustrating problem. Researchers who've looked at this generally say that the main answer is full disk encryption, because we really don't know if we have some kind of log-structured file system, whether the blocks that actually contain your data have been cleared when you erase things. Also, where leveling on flash drives is hilarious because the device actually writes your data somewhere unpredictable that you don't know on the physical device. And it doesn't guarantee that overwriting the same block will actually overwrite the same block, because it says you surely don't want to write to the same place on the drive multiple times. I think even Gutmann says that Gutmann's advice about multiple pass overwriting is obsolete. Single pass overwrite is probably enough and has the advantage that you might actually do it, whereas you might not wait around for 35 overwrites. This is safer than securely deleting a file because the structure of the file system doesn't matter. Right, so these researchers, also from the University of Washington, published this forensics paper where they say people who are using partial volume encryption, not full disk encryption, often have leakage where their operating system or their applications leave traces of the data from the encrypted volume outside of the encrypted volume. A really simple, familiar example is that a word processor like Microsoft Word may autosave. So you might have a TrueCrypt volume, and you might have all of these things inside a TrueCrypt volume, and then edit them in a word processor, and it might autosave outside of the TrueCrypt volume, and then erase the autosave file, but the autosave file can be undeleted. So this is a strong argument for preferring full disk encryption where possible. We don't really have applications and operating systems that do this kind of secure compartmentalization very well on PCs. Mobile devices are even worse because forensics on mobile devices is awesome, and counter-forensics on mobile devices is horrible. Most mobile devices that you might get have no full disk encryption option. Of course, there are exceptions to that. Most mobile devices have no secure erase option. If they don't come with one, it's often quite difficult to add yourself, especially if you have a device that doesn't give you root access. And law enforcement and all kinds of forensics professionals have extremely powerful forensic tools that are extremely automated that work on mobile devices. They can often just plug the device into a bay and have the entire contents of the device come up on their PC immediately. So mobile devices are rough. We had a slide about cameras.
Do you want to talk about it?
I just wanted to say that cameras are also a kind of electronic device that would be subject to search. And like your mobile phone, they generally won't have a secure delete option. In fact, there are lots of funny stories about how if you erase a photo on a camera, if you then put your compact flash disk into a PC, it's generally just deleted on a fat file system. So you can generally run an ordinary undelete program on the compact flash disk and undelete the photo. That's a common case. So if you had compact flash or something or SD cards that you wanted to clear, you might want to actually put them into a PC and actually overwrite every block rather than just doing the delete photos in the camera. Yeah, I think that's about it. Marcia, did you want to say anything in conclusion?
I think we have a few minutes for questions. If people have questions, yes.
You brought up phone with twice in there, so my question is, as a pro, I'm forced to give my password, that's also my Google account password. Are they limited to searching what's on the physical device? Now they have access to my cloud information as well.
That is a very interesting question. I don't think any court has ever looked at it. Our position certainly would be that they would need a warrant to access anything in the cloud. But I don't know what the government's position on that would be. And I suspect we'll be seeing a case like that in the near future.
There are anecdotes about border agents, at least in some countries, and law enforcement agents asking people for cloud service passwords and social networking passwords. And it does seem like in the US, at least in the non-border situation, there would be a lot of legal restrictions on the US government's ability to use that to go log into your account, because there are lots of statutes that protect those accounts.
Right.
But as Marcia said, I guess this has never exactly come up in a case arising at the border.
If you are previously have an encrypted file for you, would it be something acceptable to the agents to say, okay, I cannot give you the password, let's just delete it? So we pretend that they can try to pass the border, publish that up, and then do like kind of arrangements, or
I think it's possible. I think one of the things that's very difficult about thinking through these scenarios is the fact that you never know what a border agent would do. You know, we're dealing with human beings, and one border agent might suggest such a thing and find that acceptable, whereas another might not. I've heard anecdotally about a situation, for example, where an individual was bringing encrypted data into the United States, and the border agent said, "Give me your password," and the person said, "No." And the border agent said, "Okay, that's fine, just go." And you know, I think that of course that's like everybody's sort of dream scenario and such a thing, but my point is that you never know what a border agent's going to do or what they'll say. And I think the suggestion you proposed is, I think it's plausible, but I just don't know how a border agent would react for sure. And you know, one border agent's reaction may be very different than another's.
And it was very clear from reading the published policies from Customs and Border Protection, for example, that at least the public policy does not tell the agents how to handle that situation. And it doesn't say that the agents can do that, and it doesn't say that they can't do that.
Right.
Do U.S. citizens have the right to return, or can they also be returned?
So this is interesting. When we were doing the research for this paper, we operated on the assumption that U.S. citizens have an absolute unqualified right to enter the country. And when we tried to track down the case law that said that, there's basically one case from Puerto Rico from 1968 that just kind of says that, but doesn't cite any legal authority for it. And then there is one case that comes up after that that again just kind of, you know, glibly says it. And so we were not able to pin that down as well as we would have liked. And it actually seems that the legal situation there is a bit unclear. Just so you know, FYI.
I mean, so there's no court decision that directly questions it,
Correct.
but there's no Supreme Court decision, for example, that clearly says that U.S. citizens have the right to enter.
Exactly. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, is there any difference in the mode of entry, let's say boat, flying in or car?
Do you mean in terms of your legal rights?
No, actually, as far as the level of how far they will go and so on.
I don't know. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. Anecdotally, it seems to me that when you enter the United States, and over roads, and you're driving a car, you hear quite a bit about situations where people are asked to turn on their laptops, and agents look at what's on the laptops. I hear about that sort of thing much more often, actually, than people entering the country through airports or on ships. But I have never seen any, for example, empirical data on that question, and I don't know the answer for sure. Do you have any idea?
I definitely have a sense that different ports of entry vary a lot in terms of the attitudes of the CBP agents working at them, in terms of what kinds of technical training or skill they have, in terms of the volume of travelers that they have. But I don't have any concrete idea how to give a rule, like it's better to come by boat or something. I know I've entered the US by boat and by plane, and it varied a lot more from airport to airport, I thought, than between boat and plane specifically.
That makes sense.
Maybe in the future there will be sort of Yelp reviews of ports of entry, giving a number of stars and reviewing the agents. I mean, it really does vary a lot. As a US citizen who's re-entered the US a number of times, I've had CBP agents who didn't even speak to me, who just looked at my passport, saw that it was a US passport, stamped it, and handed it back to me, and I was done. And then I've had people who questioned me about my work, and one person at one point who even tried to question me about my political views because he learned that I worked for EFF. That was the most disturbing. So, there's quite a range, certainly.
So I think that our time's up, but we're happy to stick around and answer questions, and we're here for the rest of the conference, so feel free to come up and ask whatever you like. Thank you so much.